Are you mockers of me, you grabbing old men? Are you laughers at me, though I'm not yet gone? O springs of the rivers of Thebes, O reaches of the plains of Thebes, bear me witness. No one sheds a tear for me as I go to my strange new grave. No one knows what kind of laws they are that sentence me, nor what kind of tomb it is I go to. I'm a strange new kind of in-between thing, aren't I? Not at home with the dead, nor with the living.
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho-ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we are reading Sophocles' play Antigone.
It's a beautiful play. I had forgotten. I'd read it years and years ago, but not since then, and I was really moved by it.
I also read it a while ago and couldn't quite remember what goes on in it, even though it is sort of known as one of these problem issue plays that people think about when they want to think about certain political things. I just couldn't remember the details, and it was delightful to go back to it. I went through a little bit of a phase where I was reading all of the ancient Greek plays. I don't know if I actually read all of them, but I was reading a lot of them at one point in my life. They're interesting and fun to read, and we only have about 24 ancient Greek plays extant, which is a tragedy, but it does mean that you can read them all. And if you have any kind of completionist impulse, like I unfortunately do, that's really compelling as a reason to start reading them.
Yeah, well, for me, that only finds its expression in reading all of the Agatha Christie's, but I see the impulse, like I can recognize it. It was interesting what you're saying about the political dimensions of the play, because it does talk a lot about the law, and that is something that shows up also in some of the other plays. And what I was really struck by this time is like I saw the parts about the law, but I was really moved by the kind of, I don't know, human embodied experience about the kind of, I don't know if the wrong word is passion, like the extent to which people feel things deeply and how that plays out in society. I feel like that might be something interesting to talk about together.
Absolutely. And I think that's what people turn to this play for. It's often read as an early feminist work, but also like the central tragedy of the play is different interpretations of what is the right thing to do, what is the law, how should we behave as a society, as a leader, as a subject, as a polis, as a city, as people together. What does that mean? What are the conflicts and how do they play out, and what unfortunate things can happen because of them? And, those are evergreen issues, I think.
Yeah. What do we owe to one another? I mean, I can't think of a question that resonates more over time, right? And you were saying too about the extent to which it might be read in the context of feminism. Like, there is a female protagonist, or the plight of women is something that gets talked about in this play. And that might be something we unpack a little bit, especially in terms of the different options that are open to people.
Absolutely. But I think this play gets introduced to young readers in college, and it's got a strong teenage female character who's standing up to the ruler of the city, to the new king, who's also her uncle. And it's like, yeah. I think that was the way it was first presented to me. And I see why that's a compelling reading, although I think the play rewards going a little deeper than that, maybe. And I'm sure we'll get to that in a moment. But before I tell you the plot summary, I will give a little content warning. This play includes a lot of suicides. So if that's content that you don't want to hear about right now, you know what to do. So here's what's going on. Before the play begins, Oedipus, the king of Thebes, has taken his own life, as has his wife, Jocasta. If you want to know more about that, see the play Oedipus Rex, also by Sophocles. Two of their sons, Eteocles and Polynices, waged a civil war for control of Thebes, the city, but they ended up killing each other at the same moment. And now Creon, who's the brother of Jocasta, is king. And in an attempt to prevent further civil disobedience and to show himself as an effective ruler, Creon has decided that Eteocles, who defended the city, should be given the proper burial rites. But Polynices, who attacked the city, should be left out for wild animals to eat, an act of flagrant insult, disrespect, and impiety. And so the play begins with Antigone and Ismene, the young daughters of Oedipus and Jocasta, debating what should be done. Antigone declares she will bury the body herself, defying Creon, because that's the right thing to do. Ismene thinks there's no point in attempting such a thing because it will only make Creon furious and make matters worse, but Antigone is determined to do what she believes is right. And so she does. And Creon finds out that Antigone has been spotted performing the rites over the body, And she doesn't deny that that's what she was doing. And so Creon decides he must punish her by sealing her up in a cave, which is to say, in a tomb. Well, no one else likes this plan. Creon's son Haemon, who is engaged to Antigone, thinks it's an overreach of his power. The people of Thebes seem to agree with Haemon and think Antigone is doing the right thing. Tiresias, the famous seer, shows up and says that you shouldn't bury somebody alive in a tomb. Good advice. Tiresias has never led Creon astray in the past with his prophecies and his advice, and he predicts terrible things for Creon if he doesn't come to his senses. But Creon is a king and doesn't want to be told what to do by a woman, or by a youth, or by the commoners, or by some weirdo seer. And then, as is so often the case in classical Greek theater, we are told the results of this conflict through a messenger. Antigone took her own life in the tomb. Haemon went to the tomb to aid her, but arrived too late. Creon followed Haemon to the tomb, but when Haemon sees him, he's furious and tries to attack Creon. Haemon then takes his own life. Creon returns to the stage, carrying the body of his dead son, and finds out that his wife, Eurydice, has also taken her own life, cursing Creon as the killer of her children. Creon finally recognizes what he's done, and the play ends.
I found myself wondering whether this play or Hamlet has more bodies littering the stage at the end. Right? This is a real marker of tragedy.
Is that a thing that one goes to the theater for, to see the bodies piled up by the end? I don't know.
I mean, but let's just think about this question of tragedy. I mean, it's a particular genre, right? And it's about bad things happening to people. Obviously, people ending up abased, like cast down low. And it's interesting to think about how that manifests itself here, like physically, but also in terms of like what is left. What future do people face when we're in that situation, right? When everything has resolved itself. Do we want to say a little bit about the context of the play, where it comes from?
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Sophocles and Antigone and Greek theater and all that fun stuff.
Well, just a little bit. There's a lot to say, but we'll just give a little taste of it here. Antigone is a play, and as I was saying just now, a tragedy specifically, that was written by Sophocles in 441 BCE, or maybe a little bit before. What we do know is that it was performed at the festival of Dionysus that year. And the tradition of performing plays and writing plays specifically for the festivals is a very rich one in ancient Athens. Sophocles wrote a lot of plays. Some estimates are as high as 120 plays, but only a handful, about 7 of them, survive. And Antigone is the second oldest of the plays that survived by Sophocles. Antigone is often read as one of a group of 3 plays that concern Oedipus and his family: Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, and Antigone. And even though we tend to read them often as a group, they were actually written for separate festivals, so not planned as a trilogy at all. Sophocles wrote Antigone partly in response to a work actually by another playwright, Aeschylus's play 7 Against Thebes. So you can imagine an environment where plays are being written both by individual playwrights as part of their own, body of work, but also in response to one another, almost in a kind of social conversation. So Sophocles was famous already in his own time and frequently a winner of those annual competitions that we talked about that took place in Athens. He was from a wealthy family and was also involved in multiple different ways with the life of the city. He served as one of the city's treasurers, so he had financial responsibilities, and he also held military rank and died in old age, probably in his 90s. And there are many different translations of his work, and I don't know if we might want to talk a little bit about how we chose the one that we're focusing on today.
Sure. We decided we were going to focus on the translation by Anne Carson, which came out in 2015. It was created for a production that took place originally in Luxembourg, starring Juliette Binoche as the teenage hero, which...
She was not a teenager at the time.
No, but that doesn't mean she can't do it. She's a very talented actor, and it sounds like it was all very good. So we looked at that because Anne Carson does interesting translations. She has studied and teaches classics and has translated many of the Greek plays. There's a collection of her work by Euripides that I quite enjoy, but also, she's done a lot of really interesting poetic work, both on her own and a lot that specifically incorporates the Greek plays and other classical material.
And we talked about this a little bit last time when we had read Gilgamesh, and we were thinking about different translators' approaches to the text and how people who are themselves poets bring a particular mode. And Anne Carson's really interesting with ancient Greek literature because she brings that poetic sensibility, but she's also trained as a scholar in the field. So she's coming at it from more than one direction.
Yeah, I will say I also did look at another translation, a sort of more standard one that was done by Elizabeth Wyckoff. which is fine. It's a part of a sort of standard collection of these plays that, I imagine many undergrads are trained with. I was trained with an earlier edition of this many years ago, so to speak. And it's fine, but it certainly lacks the verve and the sort of poeticness of Anne Carson's translation.
And as you're saying, also, this one was made specifically with the intention of it being ready for performance. That isn't to be enjoyed, not just as a written text, but as something that would come alive. And that I think is really interesting too.
Yeah, it's interesting because she had already put out another translation of the play that was much more experimental, let's say, called Antigonick. And it is an interesting translation. We'll probably talk about it later. But let's say it is not afraid to incorporate things that were not strictly speaking in the text. It mentions Hegel and it mentions To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf and a few other things. And the director who wanted to put on a version of her play, whose name is Ivo van Hove, said, we'd love to do this, but can you give me a stricter translation of it? So she got very grumpy about that because she liked her translation, but she finally agreed to do it. And that is the later result. That is the text that we're looking at.
Yeah. No, well, it's neat to have multiple versions by the same author, right? Because it lets you think about translation and adaptation as being along a spectrum, right? And where you situate yourself depends on what your aims are and who's in the room, so to speak.
It is interesting. When she was approached by the director about this issue, she was very defensive and said that Antigonick is a translation. It is not a free adaptation, even though it is probably not going to be recognized as a translation by a lot of readers. And that's interesting to think about what that means and what it means when we even read or put on ancient literature. But we will get to that in a bit. Were there any other aspects of the translation itself that you found interesting or striking?
I thought it was just really lovely. And one of the things that I was really struck by was the orality of it. For a writer like Anne Carson, where the visual effect of the words on the page is something that is clearly being thought about. This struck me as one of her works where the orality, that is the sense, the impact that it makes on your ear, was really, really strong. I don't know if you felt that as well.
I did. And I also felt like that ties in with something that I found quite striking about it, which is the relative lack of punctuation.
Yeah, you have to do it yourself.
Yes. And that is true to the original texts, right? Ancient Greek writers didn't use punctuation, especially, certainly not the way that we do it. So it captures a bit of that flavor without making it too taxing for the reader, let's say. I've got a translation of, I believe it's Medea, that replicates ancient Greek orthography of there may not even be spaces in it, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And it's a real challenge to read.
That's so interesting. What a neat thing to do. So there are a lot of different ways into this text, and I wonder if one of the ones that might work really well is thinking about where we start. One of the things I was really struck by, again, reading it this time, is the way in which we're with the two sisters. And they're, how can I put it, similar or parallel in a lot of ways. They have the same parents. They've got the same brothers. They're in some ways in the same situation, but they make utterly different choices. And I thought that breaking apart of the choices, the options, and kind of opposing those options to one another. As Antigone puts it at one point to her sister Ismene, she says, you chose life, I chose death, right? So I found that really interesting because it's a story that is this family story, as we have it both in the play Antigone and also in the others that are related to it, is all about pairings. So it's the two brothers, right? All these different doublings that show up over and over and over again in this family plot. So it was neat to start with that, but specifically on the grounds of not just women, but young women who are kind of on the threshold of life.
Yeah. It's very efficient, that division at setting up the stakes very quickly.
And in terms of power, there's this really neat thing that happens is Antigone makes the proposal. She says, are you going to join me if you help me lift the corpse? And Ismene is like, you mean bury him? It's forbidden. And Antigone tries to persuade her. Ismene says, look, it's an unlawful act. And she says, sister, don't cross this line, whoever we are. Think, sister, father's daughter, daughter's brother, sister's mother, mother's son. Our family is double, triple degraded and dirty in every direction. And now our brothers lie slain by one another's hands. So that's it. We two are alone. Moreover, we're girls. Girls cannot force their way against men. I'm sure the dead will forgive me if I obey those in power. You always push the limit. Limits are there for a reason. It's a short little speech by Ismene, but it's really neat because it makes it clear how similar their plight is, right? We're girls. Girls cannot force their way against men. It's not just that they're women, it's that they're immature women, right? And there are limits, right? There's the law, right? There's power. Limits are there for a reason. There's a lot to say about that. And our options are completely limited within that. We're constrained within that. And that's a reality that Antigone just will not accept.
Right. And there's also the sense of who are the stakeholders in their lives? Is it the dead? What will they do? Is it the men in power? And what will they do if they act? Who do you need to consider? And Ismene is trying to thread this needle by saying, well, if we do this, if we submit to the power, then the people in charge will be fine with it. And the dead will understand. Like, they get it.
And they have power too, right? One hopes that they will forgive, right?
Yes, exactly. And Antigone understands that the dead's power far outweighs the living, and that she is required to swear allegiance to the dead in a sense, or at least this is how it's understood later on, that, she's been swearing allegiance to the dead rather than the living.
Yeah, she frames it explicitly that way when she's talking to Creon, that there's more than one law. There's the law that Creon is imposing, and then there's a law that comes from the gods, right? And not even just from the gods, specifically a law that pertains to the dead. Even the gods don't have control over that. And so there's, how can I put it? There's multiple competing laws in place here. And that whole role of the gods, I thought, was really striking. I found myself, I mentioned that I had read this for the first time many, many years ago when I myself was like a teenage girl, right? I can't even remember now what the experience of reading this play from that perspective was like, right? But one of the things I was struck by, having read together, I'd read the Iliad a number of times, the ways in which the gods are always kind of pulling the strings, or, making things happen or pushing things one direction or another. Not in a unified way, but often in a conflicting way. And it's neat how in this play too, the emergence of the gods' involvement kind of doesn't show up in that explicit way where gods show up and do things literally, as we see in something like the Iliad or the Odyssey, but rather an awareness, a kind of glimmering awareness on the part of people in this play that the gods are, as the chorus says at one point, the gods are mixed up in this somehow. Like, they're kind of aware. They're like, is something going on here? And that becomes explicit as things go on, especially once Tiresias shows up.
Yeah, Tiresias has some really interesting things to say about the gods and the dead. And he calls Creon out for violating this sense of authority over the living and the dead. He says, you've housed a living soul beneath the ground below, Antigone in the cave, and held a dead man here, not burying Polynices, without his grave or rites. It is so wrong. It is so wrong. The dead do not belong to you. In other words, Creon's power as king does not extend over the realms of who gets to live and who gets to die in that sense, or who gets to be unburied, or how you should treat the dead. Like, that's just not part of his authority as he's trying to assert his authority. But he also says, nor do they belong to the gods above. You violate these rules, there are avengers lying in wait for you now. Watch out. So the gods also don't really have a say in this. Like,
well, they're constrained too.
Yeah, even their power is hemmed in by what the dead need or want, I suppose.
Well, what's proper? The thing that Creon has done wrong, right, is he's housed a living soul beneath the ground and held a dead man here, right? So he's burying those that are alive and not burying those that are dead. And there's this kind of, I don't know what to call it, sense of what is proper, like what belongs where, right? And something that's out of place is filth, right? Is kind of catastrophic.
Yeah. But I'm also curious, like, who are the avengers lying in wait? Like, how are the dead making this known? Creon's about to experience tragedy. He's going to, enough bad stuff will happen that he'll finally feel it. And he'll finally realize that he may have done something a bit wrong. And is it the gods that are causing these things to happen? Is it the dead? Is it, like, I don't think we have a strict answer to that.
Well, this is a really interesting question. He says, as you were just quoting, like, there are avengers lying in wait for you now. Watch out, I say, right? And the specter of harm comes not from a really clearly defined kind of predator, like, whoever is lying in wait, but rather the loss of protection. Because just a little bit earlier, Tiresias has said, there's something terrible going on when we try to make sacrifices. The birds are all singing in this really weird way. I go to the altar, he says, but the fires won't light, the embers sputter, the fat slides off the bones. The failing of these signs is itself a sign, and surely these signs failed, and surely, he says, the cause is you. Right? So he goes on to describe, like, the fact that they can't make the offerings that invite the gods to provide protection. And so once you don't have that protection, you're open to this badness, which I think it's very unnameability in a way, is what makes it particularly terrifying. It's not like where, I don't know, I think back to the Iliad where there's like some gods might be helping you, other gods might be against you, but at least you kind of like see where you are. Here it's more like your protection is gone and anything could happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're doing things in such gross violation that it's not just that you've offended the gods, it's that you're breaking the system.
Exactly.
And there will be untold consequences for that.
Exactly. And it's interesting that the way that gets expressed here is, breaking the system, but in terms of filth and abjection and like dirtiness, which I think is so fascinating. Expressed both in terms of Polynices' body, which is lying out there getting grosser and grosser and like more and more in pieces. And it's like in the sun and it's like really gross. But also in terms of at the very end of the play, he says, "Oh, filth of death, who can clean you out? Oh, piling up of death, who can reckon you? You take a man already broken and grind him to dust." So when he's completely ruined, he's completely consumed with grief, he's experiencing it as not just like death or doom or something, but filth, like dirtiness. And I find that really interesting. Like it's not beautiful or clean death. It's the abject quality.
You're saying this now makes me realize another parallelism, which is between Oedipus and Creon, where both of them committed crimes of unnatural category mixing, right? And, Creon is here not recognizing the distinction between the living and the dead and not treating the living like the living should be treated and not treating the dead like the dead should be treated. And Oedipus's category mixture, of course, is that he slept with his mother and, had children. It's again, category violation, but in terms of family relationships. Yeah. So Ismene describes their family tree as being double, triple degraded and dirty in every direction because of these category violations. And I didn't quite realize how similar these were. I mean, in our minds, incest and violating the rights of the dead, we don't even really have a term for the crime that's being committed here, but they're not the same kind of thing. They're just, taboo or gross or however we want to think about them. But we don't conceptualize them necessarily as being
analogous in any way.
Yeah, they're not natural correspondences. And yet here they are working that way.
Yeah, I think because they're both being understood as perversions of an order. I think you put it really well when you talked about breaking the system. And that's where it's coming from, the integrity of the system that requires observance of all the appropriate categories and barriers, right? Things that should be together, and things that should not.
Yeah. It's such an interesting way of thinking about what the consequences of violating fundamental tenets of your society are, right? I mean, that it's not just that, you shouldn't do that because it's taboo or it's wrong or because, power dynamics or because whatever. No, you shouldn't do this because everything we understand and know will collapse. And I'm not saying I'm not unfamiliar with that kind of rhetoric, but it feels a bit different here. But maybe it isn't.
Well, I wonder if part of it has to do with how we understand the place of individuals and individual fates and individual choices relative to the collective you are inside of. So that might be a family structure. It might be something that we understand in terms of nation or city-state or some other kinds of community, right? Here, it's clear that everything is interconnected. And even though there might be the individual choice of to do this or not do it, the conversation that Antigone and Ismene have in the beginning is exactly about to do it or not to do it, right? What are the constraints on them as individuals? But at the same time, your individual choice is always inside a sort of an ecosystem of everybody else, right? And so if it gets broken in one place, it's broken every place. Or at least that's true for the ruling family anyway. I don't know if it's true only for them or if it's true for everyone in the society.
Yeah. So that actually leads to another thing I was thinking about when I was reading this, which is I feel like the mainline discourse, at least amongst sort of people reading it who aren't specialists, I have no idea what the specialist discourse is, but that this is, as I said, a feminist play. And it is about Antigone, a young woman, sort of sticking it to the patriarchy. And okay, sure, you can read it that way. And I don't want to discourage that or not like let people revel in it. But I feel like there is more to it than that. Like, as I said in my summary, the list of people who Creon will not listen to goes beyond women, though he is very virulent against women.
Yeah, they're right out.
yeah, absolutely not. But also young people.
Yeah.
Like, don't, his own son
or even the people in general.
Or the poor, or the rebel, or the whatever. Yeah. No one else has his special authority. And yet, I thought, how sympathetic are we supposed to be to Creon, right? Like, he is monstrous. And at the end of the play, very much he's been monstrous. Like, he has not been doing the right thing. But for this to really be a proper tragedy in the Greek sense, is my understanding, these things have to be sort of inevitable. Like, terrible things happen in Greek plays because everybody was doing the right thing as they understood it, more or less. And that's what makes it compelling and interesting. And like, the horror of it is, oh, I see why this happened. And if you go into it thinking Creon made terrible choices from the beginning, that doesn't seem like it's as effective. So if you think, well, no, Creon, it makes sense. Like, there's just been a terrible civil war. Creon has come into power and he's trying to keep the public peace. And so he's making some strong moves to do that. But if he doesn't, then will war break out again? Will he be killed? Will Antigone and so forth be killed anyways in the scramble for power that's been in their lives for the last while? Well, maybe. Like, how sympathetic should we be to Creon?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to think about why he makes the choices he does. I mean, it's in part because he's got this sort of sense of his own authority, this almost tyrannical kind of impulse, right? And so that's part. But there's also a kind of reasonableness to the account that he himself gives for what he chooses to do. So at an early point in the play, the guard has come to sort of reveal that Polynices' body has been buried, right? And the chorus says, "King, it's been my feeling for a long time now that the gods are mixed up in this somehow." And Creon responds this way. It's really revealing. He says, "Don't be that stupid." He says, "Gods mixed up in this? You demented old men. You think the gods buried him for his good intentions? You think the gods gave him a prize for citizenship, despite the fact he came to burn their temples down, to desecrate their laws? You think the gods find gangsters like that honorable? Well, here's a simple truth. I'll say it one time. You're wrong. Gods didn't do this, but there are men who would try, men who don't like me, men who murmur and fret and chafe under my government, men who might well lead a guard or a watchman astray with a bit of a bribe. In fact, that's exactly what happened." Right? So two things. One is he's interpreting everything that happens in terms of men's ability to rule society. Like, he's seeing it as having to do with human beings and not with the supernatural. Error number one. Error number two, he's recognizing the importance of the gods and the importance of paying respect to the gods. And that's why he says, like, Polynices, like, came in to take over the city and burn the temples down. Like, surely the gods don't favor him. But what he's not grasping is it's not just a question of who do the gods favor. It's a question of the system. You can't break the system. I mean, in other words, he's acting as if it's the Iliad, where, this god is backing this person and this god is backing this person. And there's a kind of a commensurability between what happens amongst the gods and men. But this isn't just about the gods. This is about the system, and it's about death, right?
Yes. I do want to go back to the Iliad idea for a second, because there's also an interesting scene with a dead body at the end of the Iliad. And it might be worth reflecting on how that plays into it, because now, remind me, you've read this much more than I have, and you're better at keeping hold of these images than I am. But after the big fight between Achilles and Hector, Achilles drags Hector's body back and forth.
Around and around the city.
Yeah, exactly. As a show of domination, as a show of desecration. It's not the appropriate way for treating a dead body. And this is not good.
No. Well, it causes incredible grief and unhappiness. It causes Priam to go beg for the body back. And the importance of Hector's body, like, kind of both literally and in symbolic terms, is underlined by the fact that the last book of the Iliad is exactly the funeral feast for the body of Hector, which is finally getting the appropriate rites, right? So there is that kind of common ground that the body is kind of, I don't know, like the bone of contention, like it's the focus for the events that are happening. There, though, like, the gods express concern about what's going on, like, this is clearly things are getting out of hand, but there's not that same kind of intervention in the Iliad, relative to what you see here. There's not the same kind of, like, sense of disorder on some incredibly fundamental level.
No, but I think the narrative is such that, you've got Achilles getting into a fever pitch, finally fighting, and then giving it his all. And then he's not in control of his anger.
No, it's too much.
And it's gone too much. And so he does the inappropriate thing. And there's the spectacle of that, but there's also the horror of that and the way and it ends with him realizing that he's gone far too far. And the funeral rites happening and the conversation with Priam happens at the end. And returning the body and all that. So he's not doubling down as often as Creon does.
No, that's true.
But there is a sense of, you just don't do that. Like it's an example of showing that, no, you don't treat your enemies this way.
Yeah, no, I think it's right to see that scene in the Iliad is kind of in the background here in a way. Like, what are the consequences when things go too far? One of the things that's different about the treatment here in Antigone is that death appears as this source of power. In a way that is really different, I think, from what we see in Homer's epic. And it's like not just personified, right? I don't know, maybe that's the wrong word. I mean, it gets personified in the text here. I don't know if that's the right word for the Greek play itself to talk about as death being personified. But death has its own force. There's a force and a power and a law associated with death that is beyond, or at least different from, the power of the gods. And it's, I think, so interesting that when we see passages that talk about death, that evoke death very explicitly, it's often in the context of the thing that doesn't quite fit in the system somehow. So there's actually a very beautiful passage where Antigone is describing herself, and she's, resigned to her fate, as she is really almost from the first moment, when she knows that she's going to be buried alive. She's going to be walled up in the tomb. And she says, "Look at me, people. I go my last road. I see my last light. Look, death, who gathers all of us into his old bent arms, in the end is gathering me. But I am still alive. No wedding song, no wedding chamber. Yet I shall lie as a bride in the bed of the river of death while I am still alive." That is such an interesting line.
Such big teenager energy.
She has a lot of teenager energy. She had a black t-shirt. I could see it. I know, absolutely. But so she's resigned to what's coming up, right? But it's interesting. She'll lie as a bride in the bed, right? And so you got one kind of metaphor going here, right? Bride in the bed of the river of death. So it's not just that she's a bride, but a bride of death. A bride in the bed, right? So that's that sort of metaphor, right? That sort of quasi-marital metaphor. But she describes herself as being a bride in the bed of the river of death. So this idea of, I don't know what to call it, not well-defined borders, that there's this in-between quality that she inhabits. And we saw that kind of quality of in-betweenness elsewhere too, when we had that passage at the opening where she herself says she's kind of in between states. And the in-betweenness seems to be really interesting because it's, again, like a state of potential category violation, right? You're not one thing or the other. You're not fully, in the same way that we talked about earlier, the dead are not being buried, but the alive, in the case of Antigone, is being buried, right? There's this state of not being where you should be. Right? I don't know what to make of it, but I find it really interesting to think about that and think with it and how death inhabits that space. Like me, anyways, reflexively, I would think like death over here, life over here. But there seems to be this weird kind of porousness. And I guess it's that movement across states.
Yeah, I guess so. I think it's interesting that Antigone gains the power she does through a willingness to die.
Yeah.
And to die on her own terms, with an understanding that the distinction between life and death it's important that it be sort of recognized, but the distinction of being alive and being dead doesn't seem especially important to her in a sense. She's willing to do it. She maybe doesn't want to, but she's willing to do it.
Because it has to be done.
Yeah. Well, if that's what has to be done, then it has to be done. And I guess I'm also interested in the fact that she's using this bridal metaphor. She's engaged.
She's supposed to get married to
Creon's son. And she does seem upset about the possibility of dying unwed and not sort of living out that aspect of her life. But this idea of substituting it with a marriage with death, intertwining herself so strongly with death that it is like a marriage that, gaining the power through death, through that wedding connection, so to speak, where you take on some of the power of your spouse.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I don't know how to put this. It's really difficult to put into words. It's almost like death is also present in life in some strange sense because of the repeated unburial of Polynices' body. Like we see this in that metaphor, bridal metaphor that we saw, where it's not just she's like, I'm the bride of death, right? But rather the river enters into it, right? So it's this kind of, I don't know what to call it, this flowing or undefined state. And you see something kind of similar at another point too, when Tiresias, in the scene we were talking about a little bit earlier, when he's describing how the sacrifices aren't working, he says to Creon, he says, surely, he says, These signs failed, and surely the cause is you. You bring this sickness to the city. You gave that body to the birds and dogs so that our hearths and altars are defiled. Of course the gods have turned away from us. Of course the birds are shrieking unintelligible things. Their mouths are gorged with guts and blood. He says, to err is human, but to persist in error is imprudent, unlucky, and just stupid. Yield, Creon, he says. That pile of rot that was the son of Oedipus. The boy is dead. Stop killing him. I thought that was such an interesting line. Like, how can you kill a dead body? But that's kind of what Creon is doing. And it's that weird, like, paradoxical, nonsensical state of being that they've descended into collectively here.
Yeah, I assume that the idea is that the funeral rites are part of the process of death.
That's right.
This is going to be oversimplified, but the spirit doesn't sort of go on from the body until the funeral rites are performed. And if you keep harming the body before the rites happen, then you're just trying to kill again and again.
Complete,
yeah,
right? It's not complete.
There's still space for death to be enacted, even though the body's dead. Yeah,
exactly. I think that's so interesting because, again, it's so different from the frame of reference that we might be more accustomed to.
Yeah. And it's also interesting to think about what power Polynices has in this moment, even just as a dead, unburied body.
There's still a kind of potency of the body. Like, I don't know that he has agency, right? But there's still a kind of power in that, even that dismembered body.
Yeah, through not being properly buried, he's able to cause all these things to happen, in a sense. Like, even if he's not intentionally causing it in that sense. But
by his being.
Yeah, his sheer being there, unburied, has all these rippling effects that are undermining the structures of the city. And so he has this level of power while he's in this liminal state.
And in a weirdly, again, doubling kind of sense, there's this neat thing that happens, at the very beginning when Antigone is talking to her sister Ismene, she's talking about Polynices and how she has to bury him. She says, I wouldn't take your help now if you asked me, yet I will bury him, and this is right to do, though I die for it. One day, she says, we'll lie together in the grave, he and I, side by side. For death is long. Death is very long. You go on worrying about the gods of life. He says to Ismene. And that's a really neat passage. And it's one that in her other translation, Antigonick, Anne Carson translates it a little bit differently, saying our thighs will be side by side. That's what it literally says. And I don't know if it's too much to say there's kind of an erotic charge to that, but like people you are side by side with your thighs up next to each other, like that's a thing, right? And the reason I notice it is because that sort of, I guess we could call it embodied pairing of Antigone and her brother, so that she anticipates the grave in which they'll lie side by side, gets fulfilled at the end of the play, but not in her being kind of juxtaposed with the body of her brother, but rather juxtaposed with the son of Creon when he encounters his death. And so I thought that was a really interesting way in which pairing kind of functions, and Polynices kind of drops out of it. I thought that scene was actually really strikingly vivid. I don't know if it struck you as well when the messengers were recounting exactly what happened at the tomb.
Oh, yes. It always is sort of the way in these plays, right? If you haven't read classical Greek theater before, a lot of the most important action will happen off stage.
Yeah, super interesting.
And then a messenger will come in and will just say it rather than you getting to see everybody kill each other. You get to hear that it happened. And the importance is not so much the gratification of the action, but presumably, I would think, seeing the reaction of the other people as they hear of the terrible news that has happened. And then Creon enters and he's carrying the dead body and he's breaking down and so forth. It's always interesting. I don't know if I have any real thoughts about this, but this idea of telling and not showing, in a sense, that it's not seeing what happens, it is hearing about it and the emotion that gets inflected in that is primary.
Yeah, it's so weird, right? Because you would think it would kind of evacuate the emotion from those scenes. I mean, the fact that all the big things happen off stage, right? The burial of Polynices, that happens off stage, right? That gets Antigone in trouble at the outset. The death of Haman happens off stage, and Antigone, right? Their death. The death of Eurydice also happens off stage, right? So all of that stuff is just received, and what we witness is the response, right? But in that scene that I was mentioning just now, where we hear about Haman's death and Antigone's death, the messenger says this, in a black rage, he tensed his body for the sword and drove it all the way up to the lung. Poor boy was still alive. He folded himself around the girl and breathed the thread of red blood onto her white cheek. So he lay a corpse on a corpse, and his bridal consummation was in the house of death. So that's that kind of pairing, as opposed to Antigone and her brother, it's here Antigone and Haman. But what's also weird is there's another doubling, because what's motivated Creon to do this is seeing Antigone against the back wall, says the messenger, we see her hung by the neck on a strand of silk. Right. So there's this strand of silk, but there's also the thread of blood. Right. So this kind of, I don't know what to call it. I guess mise en abîme, right? Like it's like repeated doubling that happens over and over again, kind of reaches its culmination in the tomb. And finally things can be resolved at that point, right? Because it's sinking to its lowest point where grief is just complete and Creon is basically alone at this point. It's neat. It's catastrophic, but it's really neat.
Well, he is alone, but of course, the funeral rites haven't happened for Haemon yet. Antigone is buried in a tomb, so I don't know how that would count technically or how we're supposed to interpret that or if we're supposed to think about that fact.
Or does that become their tomb, right? Remember, Antigone
Yes.
had anticipated being in the tomb with her brother. Polynices is, they burn his remains with the rites at the end, right? So rather than being entombed with his sister, the sister is entombed with her, God, I don't even know what the relationship is now. I guess it's her cousin, right? Because Creon is her mother's brother.
Right.
It's like
her betrothed.
Yeah. People are wild.
I thought we should take a moment to look at Antigonick, the first attempt, the first translation that Anne Carson did of this, and the much more experimental one. And I thought it would be useful to look at it through a particular lens, which would be that of Eurydice, who shows up in the original play and in the more standard translation very briefly. She gets one scene and a handful of lines. Here, I'll just read her entire part right here, right now. She comes out of their home and says, "Oh, people, did I overhear something? I was just going out. I was just at the door. I was going to offer prayers to Athena, just opening the door, and I thought I heard something, a voice like sorrow. And I fell back. I fainted. I was struck with fear. Whatever the news is, do tell me. Sorrow and I are not strangers." And then that's when the messenger relays everything that happened in the cave. And that's it. That's all she does. She goes back into her home, and then we find out later that she has taken her own life. What a strange role.
Yeah, there's a lot of silence to it. And that is really striking, especially if you put her up against Antigone, right? Who, it's not just speech that Antigone offers, also action, right? Eurydice is just the opposite in that she withdraws, and her action is intensely private.
So how is it in Antigonick?
Well, the character Eurydice is handled really differently here. She also appears at the end. She has a speech, but it's sort of explicitly acknowledging the gap between the way it'll be rendered here and the way it's rendered in the literal translation of the play. It starts out like this. She says, "This is Eurydice's monologue. It's her only speech in the play. You may not know who she is. That's okay. Like poor Mrs. Ramsay, who died in a bracket of To the Lighthouse. She's the wife of a man whose moods tensify the world of this story. The world sundered by her. I say sundered by her, that girl, with the undead strapped to her back." And it goes on kind of like unpacking the place of Eurydice herself, but also the place of all the people in this society who are constrained by what is possible. And a little later on in her speech, she asked this question, which kind of cuts to, I don't want to say cuts to the heart of the play, but cuts to a really fundamental part that Carson, I think, is really trying to emphasize in this version of the translation. Eurydice says, "Have you heard this expression, the nick of time? What is a nick? I asked my son, what is a nick? I asked my son." And interestingly, Nick is a character in the play, as well as the idea of a little bit, a little scrap of time, a moment of time. In the opening of Antigonick, there's a character list of all the people in the play, and one of them is a character called Nick who does absolutely nothing except sit on stage and measure things. He's continuously measuring things. It says, "Nick, a mute part, always on stage, he measures things." I'm like, that is super interesting. What is going on there? Because for the play as a whole, but also in particular for that speech by Eurydice, it means that the measuring out of time, right, the measuring out of moments, if you want to think about the fates, right, the cutting of the thread, right, the measuring and the cutting of the thread, is something that is always happening silently. It's always going on, and it occasionally surfaces and becomes visible. So that's one of the things that's going on there. That's super interesting. One of the other things that's going on there that's super interesting is that weird, not just intertextuality, but anachronism, right? That evocation of Mrs. Ramsay from To the Lighthouse is both like, again, totally anachronistic. Sophocles is not referring to Virginia Woolf, like in the usual stream of time.
Fool that he was.
Fool that he was. And also it's highly intertextual because it invites you to think about what's the common ground there. She has a couple of other moments in the play that do that as well, but that's a really beautiful one.
Did that common ground strike you as compelling?
Well, what I was really struck by was that sort of, parentheses. In other words, the stuff that happens off stage. We talked about this when we did To the Lighthouse together, the fact that the death of Mrs. Ramsay, which is like super, super, super important, happens like we don't witness it, but we witness the impact it has on the people who knew her in that middle section of To the Lighthouse. And so I hadn't thought before of the ways in which Greek drama might kind of influence the way that Woolf determined to have that devastating thing happen. But like now I'm like, for sure, that's what's going on. Thinking about it the other way too, what does the reading of To the Lighthouse give us to an understanding of what's happening in Antigone? Because I think that's valuable too. This question of women's silences and women's screams, like in other words, where does women's voice and women's action and women's presence fit in a world of laws, right? In a world of tyranny. Right? So there's like a lot to say about that. I found this actually translation super interesting in a lot of different ways, but that passage was a really great one. The other moment I absolutely loved and was fascinated by was the bird nest scene. There's a beautiful metaphor that shows up in both of Carson's translations. In the more literal translation that came out in 2015, it's a passage where one of the guards is describing what he's seen when he went to go encounter Antigone. He says he sees the huge white sun, dust blowing up, the body there, and he says, the child, making that weird little bird sound, how they cry when they see the nest empty. So she cried, seeing the body bare. So she cried and called down curses on whoever did the deed. Then she pours dust onto the body with both hands. And they capture her for trying to bury the body again and take her away. In Antigonick, it's done in this really different, wild kind of way. It's the same scene, but the language is so totally different. The guard says, "You threatened me. I went back, wiped off all the dust, left the body bare, sat up on the hill. Was it hot? Yes. Was there putrefaction and vermiculation? Yes. Was there noon sun stink? Yes. Did I doze off? No, I did not. I kept me awake then. All of a sudden a storm came up. A wind tore the hair off the trees, lofted the dust. I shut my eyes, and when I sneaked to look, there she was, the child. In her bird grief, the bird, in her child's reft grave cry, howling, and cursing, she poured dust onto the body with both hands. She poured water onto the body with both hands." So it's the same scene, but language-wise, totally different. It reminded me a lot, actually, of Joyce. I don't know if it struck you that way as well. Words like noon sun stink, it's all one word, or child reft grave cry. These like strange compounded words in a scene of overwhelming grief. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I just thought those were really a neat juxtaposition of what's happening in these two different translations. Same scene, totally different language happening. I thought that was really cool.
It was. I really enjoyed the even more heightened language and the willingness to translate the sense of the play's context that went on in Antigonick. The idea that, of course, Sophocles isn't talking about To the Lighthouse, but he is talking about other texts that we don't have access to.
Yeah.
And translating that sense of what is this in communication with is a thing that you can translate just as much as anything else. And it's perfectly reasonable to translate. Like it brings up a lot of questions about what do we expect from a translation. But I think that is fair play.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, no, I feel the same way. Like, I'm really glad to have the 2015 translation, which is a little bit more literal, and it's a really neat play text, like performance text. But I loved the 2012 one. I thought that was awesome.
Now, you were looking at the sort of reprint of it, which doesn't have the illustrations.
Yeah, this is the cheap reprint from 2015 of the 2012 Antigonick, which is great that it's so accessible. But there's this other one, right?
Yeah, it was originally intended, I believe, as a collaboration with an artist named Bianca Stone. And so it's all handwritten text in the book. And then there are these illustrations, which I believe are on vellum, that don't directly illustrate what's going on. They're much more impressionistic than that, but they're very intriguing. Let's say they ask a lot of questions about what's going on. And it's a really compelling way of staging, in a sense, this play. And it's you mentioned the character of Nick that's not saying anything and is going around measuring things all the time, which is very interesting for a script that was probably mostly intended to be theater of the mind,
Mm-hmm.
that you're not supposed to stage, and that when somebody thought, oh, I do want to stage this, they immediately asked for a new translation. I'm sure you could stage this, and I suspect people have, I don't actually know, but I think primarily it was expected that it would be read as a book, that a play for the mind. And having a character not doing anything through the whole thing, who's only mentioned at the beginning and the end, because at the end everybody leaves the stage except Nick,
who
who
exactly.
stays
Who
measuring.
continues measuring,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And that's something you have to keep in mind. You have to sort of retroactively realize he was there the whole time. He does get mentioned occasionally, like in the Eurydice speech, but it's such an interesting move. It's such an interesting way of thinking about what it means to stage
He's like a
play.
clock, kind of, right? In a way. But I mean, that's maybe not exactly right, but like he's measuring what happens in small increments.
But he's measuring it while you're not thinking about it.
That's it.
The measuring is going on even in this version of the play where you can't see it and where I can't imagine anybody is thinking on every page of this play and looking at all these illustrations and all this action and all this grief that's there to distract you, thinking someone is there measuring this whole time. Mm-hmm. But the play was also in meter, like in a very literal sense. There was some measuring going on this whole time. And while this translation is not in meter, it nevertheless is sort of in the background that this tale is being told in a measured way.
Absolutely. And and I think that also we're invited to think about that in the opening. She has a preface to this, to Antigonick. It's called The Task of the Translator of Antigone. So it's a nice nod to Walter Benjamin's Task of the Translator, right? And it's a poem. It's a very beautiful poem that is addressed to Antigone. It's like a poem and also a letter, right? And there's a ton of interesting things to say about it, but it ends with a kind of musical analogy that touches exactly on this point of what one measures and measures. She says to Antigone, "Your plan is to sew yourself into your own shroud using the tiniest of stitches. How to translate this? I take inspiration from John Cage, who, when asked how he composed 433, answered, I built it up gradually out of many small pieces of silence. Antigone, you do not, any more than John Cage, aspire to a condition of silence." So this idea of like the many silences that make up Cage's composition, the many small acts and utterances and screams even, right, that make up Antigone's voice and her experience. This is something she's preoccupied with from the very beginning to the very end. And Nick kind of enacts it. Really cool.
Well, there's a lot more I'm sure we could say about this. I will also say that if anybody's interested, there's a book called Antigone Undone by Will Aitken, who is a writer who's also a friend of Anne Carson's, who was invited to come out to Luxembourg and sort of see the last few rehearsals before the play was premiered. And he was greatly affected by this. The book is a weird combination of his own diary about this experience, about getting very depressed about Antigone and about the state of the world and how things haven't improved over 2,000 plus years and so forth. But also the second part is a bunch of interviews with the creative people behind it, with Anne Carson and the director and with Julia Binoche. And then the third part is an interesting overview of interesting readings of it, especially from a philosophical and theory perspective, because a lot of people have taken this text and done interesting things with it.
Yeah, well, it's been an important kind of proof text in philosophy in all kinds of ways, political philosophy especially.
Exactly. So there's a whole bunch more that you can do to explore Antigone if you want, but we here get to move on to another text.
A very different one.
A very different. Yeah. No, this is a very different text. I was going to challenge that, and I thought, no, it's different.
But they're both kind of about affective bonds and love.
Sure, but so many books are.
Yeah, that's true. They're all about it, right?
So what are we reading next?
We're reading the Song of Songs, which will be, I think, really neat to read because we can situate it in a couple of different contexts, right? As part of the Hebrew Bible, but also it's a text that has a very long kind of afterlife and reception history. Maybe you'll say a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. But in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for things we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/66. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
See you again at the Spouter-Inn.